This show is strictly for educational purposes. The opinions expressed on the show are personal to the individuals appearing in the show and not those of Thinking Tree Ecoholics Private Limited. The show is not intended to offend or defame any individual, entity, caste, community, race, or religion, or to denigrate any institution, person, living, or dead. Listener discretion is strongly advised.
Hello and welcome to Ecoholics Thinking Tree series. Today we have with us very distinguished personality, Professor Sebastian Morris. He is currently working as a professor at a prestigious Indian Institute of Management, Ahmedabad. Welcome, sir. Welcome to our show.
Thank you.
Today's topic is very interesting topic. Look East, Act East, Follow East, India's growth story in comparison to the East Asian model. Now, Indian economy took a major turn in the year 1991 when we decided to shift from license Raj and enter the era of liberalization, privatization, and globalization. In the face of growing unemployment and the restless energy embodied in the Indian youth, maybe a similar shift of economic stance is the need of the hour. Many economists suggest the East Asian model for India to become a $5 trillion economy by the year 2024-25. What is this model? Whether it is feasible for India? What are the major differences in approach between East Asian countries and India? Are a few of the questions that we will have answered today in conversation with Professor Morris. To begin with, sir, I was reading a popular article published by The Hindu titled Inappropriate Template for the Legitimate Target. The writer suggests East Asian model for India to achieve a $5 trillion target by 2024-25. First of all, what is the East Asian model in reference to the whole export-led growth versus laissez-faire debate?
Well, good. You asked a very interesting question, and I think it's going to be particularly important for India, going forward. See, the first thing to recognize is that 20th century industrializations, particularly post-World War II, and the continuing industrializations. When I say industrializations, I really mean the economic transformation, that is becoming an advanced country, is all about East Asia. Because there are no other independent economic transformations starting from World War II. All others either completed their transformation in this period, which they had started early. So it becomes very, very important to understand the East Asian model, because these are the only countries which have done so. All others may have grown, they may have raised their incomes, but their prospects of pushing all the way to being an advanced country are very weak or not there. Notable examples would be the Latin American. They have been middle income countries now for almost a century. But East Asia has come from behind and overtaken them. East Asian economies have lesser advantages as compared to Latin American, but they have done far better. See, the other reason why it's important for India is that, our endowments, particularly land-man ratios, population density, that sort of thing, is fairly close to East Asia. I mean, we can always find quite a number of countries whose endowments ratios are similar to that of India.
Yes.
See, a third reason which I can think about, why East Asia is important, is because you see, I can only quote the Anna Karenina principle, that unhappy families are unhappy in a huge variety of ways. So there's no great point in studying unhappy families except to correct them. However, happy families have a great deal of similarity. So in other words, all those who have successfully transformed East Asian as well as the earlier countries, which are now the rich countries, they all show certain essential characteristics. The differences are contingent on their size, because of their size, and because of the time they started the process. So in economics, we have an idea of late industrialization. And the first thing I would like to say is East Asian industrializations or economic transformations are essentially a type of late industrialization or late economic transformation where the external markets are being actively addressed. And it's essentially a catch-up, a very successful strategy of catching up. You see, now, yet, the East Asian model is not, something which is well understood. Just to give an example, even the great Krugman, for instance, during the East Asian crisis, made a point that, look, East Asian growth is all hollow because their total factor productivity share in growth is a pathetic 20% or less. Now, my counter to that is very simple. All of East Asia is starting from below. So they have a huge unemployed, poorly employed, weakly employed, underemployed labor. So the first thing that you do is use idle labor, unemployed resources. So when you do that, your input factor or the input share in growth is likely to be very high. Okay. So you grow at 10%, 2% comes out of technology, 8% comes out of inputs. That doesn't mean the growth is hollow. It simply means that they are doing what is right. Okay. Now the same would not be true of America or of China or Japan today, but it was certainly true of Japan and China earlier, and of East Asia earlier when they were catching up. So when you are at the frontier, you grow differently. When you are catching up, you grow differently. And this distinction is not there in much of the literature. And that's where the policymaker gets completely confused. Okay. Now, I've said this much, but let me now list out the essential, why it becomes difficult for everybody to appreciate in East Asian transformation. Let's look at two mainstream, kind of approaches in the conceptualization. I mean, theory, which, all economists go through, and therefore, it kind of has a hold over them, and then they may not be able to exit out of these, simplistic or very simple models. A good example would be the so-called, pure trade theory model. Okay. So in the pure trade theory model, essentially you have a highly abstract model. Okay. It's so abstract that it has only two commodities. And if you promote exports, you're discriminating against your importables. Okay. And if you are doing import substitution, you're discriminating against exports.
Yes.
A realistic model where you have more than two sectors, for instance, if you bring in the non-tradables, allows you to do simultaneously export promotion and import substitution, which is essentially what these guys did. Okay. And however, theory does not have the space to understand this and therefore treats it as laissez-faire. Okay. Just because you see their glorious expansion of trade. Okay. But actually, if you look at mainstream trade theories, their stupendous expansion cannot be explained by merely trade theory. Okay. The reason is these are hundreds of times. South Korea, for instance, had a 360 times increase in manufactured exports over a 15-year period. Okay. Taiwan 190 times. Okay. And one can go on. China was actually a smaller exporter in 1979 than India. It has gone on to become the world's largest. Okay. Now, your mainstream, Heckscher-Ohlin kind of models and so on just cannot explain. Okay. So that's the reason why, the intelligence here gets it wrong. The other reason is, there's just one reason. There are another reason which I can see. Now, let's look at your macro models, macroeconomic models. All macroeconomic models treat what is called the full employment level of output. For us, for third world countries or emerging economies, what we would call the capacity output as given. So in the short run, it's given. Okay. And there are no questions asked about the long run. Okay. But in a catching up economy, let me call it YF. If this capacity output can increase at a certain rate, then I can actually push demand so that demand never crosses the capacity in a very significant way to be inflationary. So there is actually a glide path all the way. So there is actually a free lunch. That's what I'm trying to say. And these guys have hit upon that free lunch. Okay, which your classical or more conventional theory does not allow you to even understand or appreciate it. Okay, so now let me put it in a third way. Okay, let's imagine that there are unemployed resources, particularly of labor. Okay, so what's the marginal cost of labor? We all know it's equal to zero.
Yes.
Right. So if I can use labor and get even very little out of it, okay, as long as the output is sold abroad, I've made a gain. Because otherwise, the marginal cost is only zero.
Yes.
So, export-led growth, or what these guys have done is they have engaged their idle labor, done all the machinery, raised the savings rate to do all that, and all that else that is necessary. Okay, exported, use the world markets to grow very rapidly. Okay, and who are the biggest beneficiaries of East Asian growth? It's actually the advanced countries.
Yes.
Okay? Because they get the product cheaper and cheaper and cheaper. But these guys don't lose either. So therefore they advanced. Okay. So both the left and the right and the conventional academia, all of them have got it wrong. Okay. So the only sane, let me say descriptions or analysis really comes from some of the scholars in these countries. Okay. And I would say that I've struggled hard with this problem, and this is the conclusion that I've come to. Okay. Yeah. So that is what the East Asian model is, very briefly. I can get into the details if you so desire. Okay.
Talking about one of the features attributing to the success of East Asian economies was the bureaucracy of these economies, referred to as embedded autonomy. This allowed the state to be autonomous yet embedded within the private sector and enabled the two work together to develop policies or change course if the policies did not work. How do you see this in the context of India?
Well, in your question is an assumption, okay,
Yes.
that the state was the same in all these countries. Okay, that's not true. Okay, the state ranged from kind of very right-wing state, for instance, in the Korean system, okay, to a very left-wing state in China, in Vietnam, okay,
Vietnam.
to a middle-of-the-road left-wing transiting to become more, capitalist in China, okay, to an extreme right-wing one in Taiwan. Okay, now it's not the political orientation
Yes.
of the countries which are important. Okay, in let's say export-led growth or in the East Asian transformation. Okay, but what is important is the nature of the state. Okay, and here one would say that the capability of the state is important. Okay, now when I say the capability of the state is important, I don't mean to say that every state must have the same capability that is shown by Singapore, which I would characterize as almost so highly capable that it's almost like a corporation. Okay,
Yes.
and that doesn't make sense, for any large country. So if one were to rank these states, the original capability of many of these countries were not, something to drive home about or speak very much. Of course, they have built state capability over a period. So I would see the state capability as being important. However, it is something that has co-evolved with their success, and their success is due to the strategic aspect, the strategic thrust of following the export-led growth. Okay? Because that's a guaranteed success.
Okay.
Now, let me just build a certain point here. Let's go back, when people say, oh, how can India do it and so on. Okay, remember the Indian state was actually quite competent. Its competence has reduced. It was able to take a very great strategic position in the 50s and so on. In fact, the import substitution of India I would rank as one of the more successful stories. In a matter of nearly 15 years, the Indian economy diversified highly.
Yes.
Now, after that, you don't have to hang up. After having diversified, that kind of closed door, let's say license Raj had done its job. Now, if we like idiots want to hang on to it forever, that's our problem. There's nothing wrong with the idea that, you start the whole process of industrialization with import substitution. And all of them did that. But they quickly changed tack,
Yes.
including China, to go completely export-led, which means use the advantage that you have built up in the form of a diversified economy and let it loose on the world for their benefit and yours. Okay, so if had India turned tack and turned export-led in '64, we would have been ahead of China by quite a significant margin. Okay, unfortunately, it was not done. Even a laissez-faire movement from the '64 did not happen, which people like Bhagwati and so on were asking.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah.
Yes.
So what I'm saying is to address your question frontally. See, there's another point. Suppose if I say that look, the Indian state is not capable. Okay. Now, whether or not you follow export-led growth, you bloody well need some capability in the state, for the simple reason that you can't go on with this kind of pathetic delivery of public services in India. Okay?
Yes.
The police will soon make India into a failed state. Okay, it's a private army of the government of the day, and there are corrections which are possible. Okay, in terms of serving, let us say, providing public services like drinking water, sanitation, sewerage, education, school education, and so on, it's gone from bad to worse. Okay, now, so the Indian state's capability is falling. We know the correctives. The correctives are in terms of greater autonomy. Okay, reworking the relationship between government and enterprise, particularly public enterprise, I think it's very important. And a bit of education of the people who hold power. You see, the Indian bureaucracy is a class unto itself. Very capable individuals. However, as a system, it completely fails. Now, what is the reason? There are some significant reasons which are correctable. They don't believe in organizations. They are person dependents. dependent. None of the government organizations have a memory and are learning organizations. Okay, so they are forever firefighting. They're all glorified operational managers. None of them have the time or the wherewithal to sit back and think and brainstorm and come out with something meaningful upfront. The few such instances when it has happened, the initiative has come from outside, such as the GQ, the Golden Quadrilateral, the NSDP actually, and so on, actually came from the IDFC. Now, people like Manmohan Singh and Montek and Deepak Parekh have understood this. And if you see, when they had a relatively free reign, some improvements did take place in the right direction. Okay. So I would say that there is nothing forever sealed about the Indian state. I mean, the Indian state, if it's not capable, you can improve its capability. It's not like, we have inherited the stripes of the tiger. Okay. That would be nonsense. Yeah. Okay.
So quick question, sir, short question, because when you said that we cannot compare small country Singapore like a big country India, can we replicate the Singapore type model to a particular city?
No, I'm not recommending the Singapore model or any of these countries' model, because all have their specificities which we need to understand. Okay. However, and Singapore was not so much an export-led growth case. Okay, it was more of a corporate state. Whereas I would look at China, at Vietnam today. Okay, Thailand, most importantly. Thailand is a democracy. Okay, and maybe Taiwan. Okay, and all of these together to see what is the essential. See, what are the essentials? Okay, all others are non-essentials. They can differ. They can vary. So let's not get carried away by the over. By the specificities. So the specificities are not important. It's what unifies them all. And when I say unifies, it's not just what is common to all of them, but which when you put together analytically makes sense. All of them spent efforts overcoming what we call the endowments constraint.
Yes.
Okay. Now this is well understood in India. Okay. But the belief is, look, you can't do it. Now what is this endowments constraint? Basically educating, a bit of land reform, may not be that necessary now, so that people can participate in a market economy. Okay, so Japan, for instance, by 1905, all the children, including the girls, were in school. Okay, Korea from 1964 onwards, not a single child was out of school. China from 68 onwards, it's clear that very few kids were out of school. Okay, so schooling, can we not improve school education? Can we not just extend the let's say the no-nonsense Kendriya Vidyalaya model all over the country? Can we not have rational strategies to bunch people, bus kids and so on? I mean, it's a simple matter. Okay? So we can do this. So what one is saying is schooling, public health.
Yes.
Okay, this so that the worker can actually participate in the market. Okay, so he has something to offer to the market by way of his skills and some endowments. Okay, agriculture, the agricultural constraint needs to be overcome. Okay, none of these countries had an agricultural constraint because they all carried out land reforms of one kind or the other. Okay, now I'm not saying you do a politically parallel land reform. All you need to do is relax the land constraint on agriculture.
Yes.
Let farmers, who are actually cultivating, let them get control over the land. If need be, compensate the others. In some other cases, do the reverse. So that the incentive to increase the output is removed at one stroke. And when you do that, the agricultural output can easily grow at 5+. Okay? And if that is there, you have a high-speed growth basis. Okay? So these are two things. Third one is, why ignore the outside world? There's a whole world waiting out there. Remember, unlike China or East Asia, we are in a more advantageous position. Because by the time we get onto it, that is now, much of the rest of the world is better than us. And therefore, the external market is going to be fantastic. Even small corrections to our competitiveness should allow us to do wonderfully well. Okay, so what I'm saying really is that India is ripe and riper than other countries to do it. And if we don't do it, my prediction is we not just enter into a trap, middle income trap, but if we can't break out of the so-called lower middle income trap, India will collapse finally.
Yes.
Okay, because North will go its way with its obscurantism and being let loose. Yeah.
Sure. The East Asian model was largely a story driven by a newly industrialized economy of Singapore, Hong Kong, South Korea, Taiwan, popularly clubbed as East Asian tigers, and Japan earlier. The
Yeah.
majority of policies followed by these countries effectively avoided the middle income trap that, as you have mentioned just now, and
Yeah.
that led to development. What steps, according to you, are necessary for India to come out of middle income trap?
Yeah. So, I mean, let's take, what would be necessary. I've already implied, in
Yes,
what I said. First
yes,
of all, I think we need to set our education right. Okay.
yes,
We need to bring in farmers into the system. Okay. And here, ideological moorings and fundamentally doctrinaire assumptions are not important. Okay. Agriculture is not something which can be subject to entirely left to market forces. Okay. None of the East Asian countries are competitive in agriculture. Okay.
yes,
Because they just can't have a comparative advantage. They are highly restricted in terms of their land-land ratio. So China is the world's most efficient agricultural producer, but it's one of the least competitive. Japan is again a very efficient producer, but it's least competitive. These countries, however well they do in agriculture technically, they will not be able to compete with the rest of the world, particularly the land-endowed countries, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and so on. And they have a plan. Okay, and that's what you see. Whereas India is going helter-skelter. We don't know whether to protect agriculture or not. We
yes,
need to. But then after protecting, we need to liberalize local markets. Okay, we need to carry out land reforms of one kind or the other, different in different parts, so that agriculture grows. So, when today the middle class is so utterly selfish that they don't want to see a terms of trade rise in favor of agriculture.
indeed.
Okay, and unless that happens, you cannot get rid of rural poverty.
Yes,
Okay, and that means that Indian agricultural prices on the whole would be higher than global agricultural prices in the long run. Okay, that it's not so today is only because a lot of our farmers are in a langot. They just don't have a proper existence. And however much they raise their head, we kind of bang them back by making them suffer this kind of agricultural penalty, terms of trade penalty. So the
indeed.
last 3 years has seen a decline in the agricultural prices related to other prices. Now, if you look, China, you know, faced the same problem in the 80s. It did not stop the macroeconomic growth. It did not constrain. It did not, come out with a huge liquidity, cut and so on, to stop the inflation. It understood pretty well that this is a supply side inflation, more so a kind of a peculiarly structural one, which is a one-time one to allow the agricultural sector to enjoy a better terms of trade. This happened in the 80s. So they
Yes,
tolerated an overall inflation of what, 12%, with agriculture running at close to 18% inflation. Okay. And then
yes,
they came out of it. They didn't constrain the economy because of this inflation. So you have to understand inflation. And let me say, sorry to say this, but the RBI has simply not understood the nature of inflation.
seriously.
Okay. It has not understood that it's supply side and you don't go fighting.
Yes,
That it's unable to separate the core from the other. It is unable to separate the what we call the expected aspect of inflation, the secular expected trend, which can be upward. Okay. That has actually never been, but it has always changed. Its forecasts, conditional on its own actions of what the future inflation would be, has been always wrong and in the same direction. So you can imagine how wrong it is. So the
yes,
first thing I would say is that macro policy has to be a lot more accommodative, okay, to allow for growth. Okay, that's
yes,
the current need of the hour. Okay, and of
definitely.
course, we need to strategize our exports. Okay, now let me
Yes,
just give you something which is actually laughable. Okay, here we make a huge statement of make in India.
yes,
Okay, but let's look at the policies. Okay, entirely orthogonal to it. We make
seriously.
a huge statement about, let's say, food processing. India is the only country in the world with a ministry of food processing. Okay, but it has the least amount of processed foods. Now the answer to my mind is simple. You can't keep going on and on in an administrative operational way. You need the right policy. But what's
True.
the policy? The taxes, GST is hugely discriminative against agricultural processing. So if you put tomatoes into a carton, and sell it make a puree of it, it attracts 18% duty. Why the hell would food processing take place? Okay.
Yes,
So things like that. So when we probe deeper, why does Make in India fail? Tariffs are inverted.
Yes.
only slowly getting corrected. Okay? Negative effective protection rates. Okay, in a large number of
Yes.
industries, there are long-term comparative advantages, including export, including electronics. Worse, okay, tie-in when we tied up on the WTO. Do you know that, or what we call the bound tariffs
Yes.
on the most dynamic items? Okay, mobile phones, flat screen TV, okay, solar panels have been bound at near zero or 4-5%. And then you announce bombastic demand growth situations or programs, get all the get the Chinese to import all to supply all the solar panels, and then go and lose the case 3 times in the WTO.
WTO.
You know, the WTO has laughed its way. When I was there taking a bunch of Indian trade service officers, it came as a shock, but not really a shock. It was a shock, but not a surprise. That, let me put it that way, that we lost the case 3 times on the solar panel, and we still don't have a sense of shame. Okay, simple coordination would have allowed different strategies to have Indian domestic value addition in solar. Okay.
Yes.
Now, in electronics, we have tied to such low bound tariffs, you can't give a tariff based solution, which China did 15 to 18 years back to create its electronics industry. Okay,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
So China protected its electronics industry for a while, and then given the large home market, it could just blow up. Okay?
Block.
All the ecosystems could come around. Whereas we want to put the cart before the horse, not give enough protection. So our bound tariffs are zero. So I can't say that, look, if you assemble in India, you will get a zero duty. Whereas if you do, CKD, I mean, if you get fully imported equipment, then it will be 150% because our bound tariffs are some 5-10%.
Seriously.
So we should go and change these. Okay. Then, Ministry of Commerce doesn't coordinate with Ministry of Industry. So Ministry of Commerce is signing away free trade agreements with Vietnam and others. And Ministry of Industry is trying to promote electronics. One ministry doesn't see what the other is doing. Okay.
Seriously.
So this kind of immaturity really cheats Mr. Modi of his great objective. Okay. So there's nothing more important than Make in India. There's nothing more important than Swachh Bharat. Okay, if you get both these right, Swachh Bharat, Educate India will improve the endowments
Endowment.
of the masses. And if you can get Make in India right, you will have to go exports. And if you get it, and import substitution at the same time, we are one of the largest importers of electronic goods in the world. Okay?
Yes.
So, about 80% of our consumption is imported. If you can actually import substitute that and intelligently, India should become one of the most competitive countries and export to the entire world. In 10 years, you should be flooding the world markets. Okay. But does our bureaucracy even strategize? Does it even have a thinking? These jokers are forever caught in firefighting. That's it. And that's where the real problem is. So these are obvious steps which we need to do, change tack and strategize.
It's a phenomenal point, sir, because it's an opportunity in the century. Once in a century, it will come for India, demographic and other things also. So
Yeah.
you have to take advantage.
Absolutely. Now, the interesting thing is, willy-nilly the COVID, okay, and willy-nilly China's stupidity in global, politics, where it's going aggressive a little too prematurely,
Yes.
okay, gives a glorious opportunity for India.
India.
So even if we don't gear up, rotten apples or ripe apples are going to fall on our head.
Yes.
All we need to do is actually catch a little bit.
Yes.
Okay. But even that we may not do. Now, of course, if you strategize, the 21st century should be India's century. Okay. There's no doubt about it. But it's a foregone conclusion that we'll do nothing of the kind. We'll fail on the economic front. And therefore, the political guys would be forced to, make people run after cows and buffaloes. Yeah. Anyways, yeah. Sorry.
When we talk about factors of growth, India has a huge advantage over the world with its demographic dividend, as we were mentioning. However, over the last 28 years, we have understood that with the mismatch of growth in literacy rate in comparison to the growth in service sector, that cannot enable the service sector to absorb India's workforce. What options does India have to use this demographic dividend in the most productive way possible?
Yeah. I've already said that. I mean, there's nothing more labor absorbing than an export-led growth.
Yes.
Okay, and it's ready to absorb. Okay, uh, electronics industry can be huge, and it's easier to do than even auto. Okay, so what I would say is that export-led growth, which can spread in across the board, and India is ready. India has competitive advantage in every good area. Okay, so even while we do software and VLSI design and things like that, design of mobile phones, we are very good at that. The labor intensive, semi-skilled, using rural women, that kind of thing can only happen on a large scale if you have electronics, light engineering. Okay, textiles. Can you imagine? Textiles and garments have gotten out of India because of adverse policy. Okay, so these can absorb. So Modi's dream of providing employment actually requires a stroke of the pen, not running after foreign investors and so on. You see, the poor guys, problem is he sees everything as operational. It's not. There is strategic, there is policy. Okay, so unfortunately the advisors have not risen up to their roles and provided them with that kind of a framework. Okay, so what he's asking for a high speed growth of India, and that cannot come unless you absorb this labor. Now let's come straight to this demographic dividend. Okay, now this keeps coming up all the time, and the reason is, I think there's a lot of damage which was done by McKinsey when they highlighted this demographic dividend, perhaps unintentionally. Of course, their intent was never to say that it's there for you as something tangible out there which you can pick up. It's a contingency. If you do all that I'm saying, it means if you can really have a high-speed growth process growing where labor is absorbed, then yes, there is a demographic dividend. In itself, just because there are so many youngsters, it doesn't mean that there is going to be a dividend.
Dividend, yes.
Okay, so it's a potential, but the potential dries up if you don't. It's like a cow. It's just given birth, feed it well, it will give you good milk. Okay, but if you don't, if you make mistakes and once it dries up, it's gone. That opportunity is gone. Now let's take actually the workforce in India. We have one of the lowest participation rates in the world. Okay, and even that participation, if you account for disguised employment, that means people who think that they're employed but actually are scratching out an existence. Okay? It's even lower. Okay, so practically most of the women are, in that sense, simply not participating, and there is no reason why they should, with such poor job prospects. Okay, so getting the jobs up and running would be actually part of realizing this demographic dividend. But let's not go bonkers about it. The reality also is that some 20% of India's workforce has been permanently mired. Okay, when they were young and when they were children, the malnutrition has not only weakened them in a physical sense, but the hand-eye coordination is also very weak. So many of them will not be able to do the kind of activities which modern technology requires. Nevertheless, these are not the constraints. Okay, there is always a set of people who are waiting to get jobs and work quite good at working. Even they might even be illiterate, but they are there. So this demand is the issue, not the supply of labor. This whole skills constraint, government of India was taken on a big ride by organized industry. That's okay. I mean, you certainly help development of skills, but the point is you need higher employment growth rates.
Yes.
Okay. Now, if you look at the data, you see, you can't just look at unemployment in India. You have to look at employment growth rates. Okay. So, because while the unemployment may reduce as it has in the last 1 month, the employment has fallen. Okay, and the labor force. Okay, so the labor participation is also important. Look at the three together and you'll realize the story that from 2010-11 practically nothing has happened.
Yes.
Okay, we have been on a massive recession. Okay, it's the longest recessionary period. Okay, and ensured by a government which had put growth uppermost. Because just by being willing strongly and being emotional about it, you don't get it. You need that, that creative, that kind of coordinated strategy. And that's what is completely missing in this government. knee-jerk reactions, simplistic, middle-class kind of orientations.
Okay. Yes. Given an unfavorable global economy and much changed economic dynamics in the past several decades, the East Asian model may no longer be valid. For the 21st century economy of global overcapacity, automated production, muted demand, what are your views on this? What are the future opportunities?
This is something which I have heard right from my school days. Okay, I can remember the entire left wing in Calcutta. Okay,
Yeah.
saying that, look, what the hell, what is East Asian growth and small countries? Fallacy of composition will ensure that China would never be able to follow that. TK up to Korea, it's fine. Now that China has done it, China has done it, where is the space? The big elephant has walked, and therefore there's no track left for us. So these are the kind of things which are being said. But I'll go back and I'll repeat what I said. Okay? On the demand side, it's going to be even better because China has crossed. So they're not really in competition on the really labor intensive side of things.
Yes.
Okay, they are buyers. So a lot of our products which are labor intensive would shift out from China, and that gives us an opportunity. The Chinese enterprise will also shift and come here. So this kind of barrier between India and China at this stage, is not very functional from the long term. So I would see China as one of the important investors in India in labor intensive industries in the future. Okay, now you might say the world is full of automation and therefore, what is the hope of labor intensive industries and so on and so forth. See, remember what I said, that the marginal cost of labor is zero. If you can employ all of Indians in IT and in high-tech industries, please do so. So what is the alternative? Can you do that? You can't. So what are we talking about? Whereas I can employ 10% in high-tech, 20% in moderate kind of industries, and the remaining in very labor intensive activities. What's wrong? We want everybody to be professors, is it? And robotic experts. That's a nonsense. That can only be an extreme Brahmanistic viewpoint, which has been our destruction.
Yes.
Okay. So it's an impossible. When you really ask what the counter is, there is no counter. Can we grow the world's food with 2% of the world's land? That's also ruled out. Okay, so many people say, we can develop agricultural exports. What nonsense. You can do it. Sure, a little bit. Double, triple what we are doing. Okay, more mushrooms. Get the phytosanitary conditions right. Even that is difficult. Okay, you want sanitary conditions right. Or animals would not be acceptable in the Western world. They are only eaten where, where food is really cooked. Okay, so the promise of the WTO on agriculture was anyway nothing much if you recognize India's land-man ratios. But even if we were to exploit it fully, it would not be much because we still suffer from phytosanitary conditions. Solve that, even then it won't be great. In some labor-intensive areas, there can be quite a good movement. Give us some buying time, 5 years, 6 years, whatever. But beyond that, no. Because we don't have the world's land, therefore we have to go manufacturing, we have to go services. Now, what's the problem with services? To the extent you can do it, do it. So I'm not saying don't do IT. I'm not saying don't do design. They are very important. They are our export-led growth industries. Sure. I'm saying include manufacturing. There's nothing wrong with that. Indians are not born, with a stamp which says that they are only good for services and they were born. No such thing. Remember, in 1950s, India's export of manufactures was higher than that of China. India had a world share of the world textile industry of 15%, which China only achieved after in recent times. Okay, which was the highest in the world at that time. India's bicycles were sold all over Asia. Okay, so India's net trade in manufactures was hugely positive in the 50s. One is not talking about something which is beyond anybody's capacity. A huge, huge industry in India, MSMEs, mid-sized, all are waiting to get the macro policies right. Low interest rates, more aggressive exchange rates, and direct support, remove all barriers, and of course tariff corrections.
Yes.
Yeah.
Another argument that comes in contradiction to the East Asian model in India is that in East Asia, welfare was conceived as a support system to keep industrial workers on the job. Helping the young, old, and poor was seen the responsibility of the family, not of the state. Rural workers got few welfare benefits because the plan was to push them off the farms and into factories.
Yeah.
Contrast those attitudes to India. The government is suspicious of the private sector, and elections are fought on promises of generous welfare benefits for the poor, the elderly, farmers, many others. What is your opinion of this kind of behavior?
Yeah, see, good. This question has come up. So what you see today in India, this highly dysfunctional, consumption subsidy and nothing else. Okay, high, and when I say that at two levels. Okay, direct subsidy is good vis-a-vis indirect or subsidy to the industry. However, as long as they are consumption subsidies, they have a problem because we are not that rich and to grow by direct subsidy. As a holding out operation, I have nothing against it. In fact, we have been the guys who have been saying that give direct subsidies, endowment subsidies.
Yes.
Very early, 15 years ago we talked about it. Today it has been kind of accepted, and don't use price-based subsidies and so on.
Yes.
But if you think that the government is messed up, if you think that the kind of support or the kind of initiative which in East Asia could not happen in India because of our poor governance, I would say that our poor governance is itself partly a reflection of the failure of our economy, or of having not had a strategy and therefore not having worked now for more than 25 years, maybe 30 years. Okay, so it's that. So let's get back. There is a lot of also misunderstanding of what happened in many of these East Asian economies. I mean, it's believed that China did not subsidize their or did not support their rural side. That's completely false. China, after the open door policy, changed the agricultural deal by which the agriculture could grow at 6%, and the biggest beneficiaries were rural people. Now, the point is the rural has to benefit, but how does it benefit? Now, if you take a view that there is no way it can benefit through a normal process of growth and I have to give them something,
Yes.
then you're making the error. Whereas if you have a employment-oriented strategy which is willing to transfer surpluses to agriculture through the price effect, okay, you don't have to do this driblet NREGS.
Yes.
Okay, now don't glorify NREGS. It's required. It's probably one of the best programs going in the country. I would say that, and at this point, it's very important. However, you can't have an economic transition based on NREGs. Okay, you can't have an economic transition based on giving 7,000 rupees of farm subsidy. Okay, you have to think through what are you going to do with the excess production in the currently. Demand side has to grow. Demand cannot grow unless the employment in in industry and so on can grow. Unless people become well off to buy the fruits, vegetables which are being now produced in excess. Okay, so let's get back. What I'm saying is this whole idea that India can't do it, and the West and the East Asian did just one thing, that is quite wrong. At certain times, they have also subsidized. Okay, they have promoted their agriculture. They have also protected their agriculture. Okay, but at other times, they have also given massive fiscal transfers. Okay, now that's another problem in India. Now look at our fiscal transfers. We have also done massive fiscal transfers. Okay, for instance, Goa contributes, let us say, 16 rupees to the central exchequer and gets back 1 rupee, given the finance commission and so on.
Recommendation.
This may have gone up after the GST. Okay, now in contrast, Bihar contributes 1 and probably gets back 4. Okay, now I'm not saying that there is anything wrong per se. Nation building means that poorer areas get more. However, what has been wrong, what remains wrong, and what is not even recognized by the finance commissions is that this kind of dispensation, the form of that dispensation is very important. If it goes towards merely supporting consumption subsidies, it becomes a zero-sum game. I give up and you get something. However, I give up for a while and you go and use it to grow even faster than I do. It becomes a positive sum game. Now in China, fiscal transfers have been positive sum games. Okay, the interior did not grow as rapidly as the coastal areas. Okay, but soon enough, the fiscal transfers began, And once the reform happened, the interior was the fastest growing area of China. So when it entered into the global financial crisis, the interior was growing the fastest, and it continued to grow even faster till 2014. And even now, the differential is that the interior is growing faster than the coastal areas. Now, how did they achieve that? Because the fiscal transfers were functional, not just a guilt-based support, family-like transfer.
Yes.
Okay, so it's not, I'm not the head of the family. यहाँ से elder brother से निकाल के younger brother because वो slightly dumb है उसको दे दिया, ऐसी बात नहीं है. Okay? I may take from the elder brother and give it here, but that guy has to come up, because we're not talking of brothers, we're talking of economies. Okay?
Yes, it's a transitory. It means it's just there to build capacity. And this is not for consumption. And that's a very, very valid point. That's a phenomenal solution. When we talk about states disparity in our country, states, as you have mentioned, finance commission distributed, but these distributions are obviously sometimes in favor of some states, sometimes favor of another state. But when I was reading last year's economic survey, they talked about the dwarf industry. You must have heard about that. India's MSME were not able to convert into big MNC if we compare with the MSMEs of America and other Western countries. How do you see, what is the lacuna where India's MSME cannot become MNCs?
No, I mean, I would beg to differ that all MSMEs must necessarily become large. That's an impossibility. Okay, but and that's not the point. Okay, I have a book. If you want, you can look up this. This is Growth and Transformation of Small Firms. I think it remains valid, written in 2001. So, broadly, if you have a functional process of growth and high growth, what will happen is the following. Okay, you are likely to see a pattern of evolution of MSMEs and industrial structure more generally, which would fit, I'm just forgetting the name, but Ishikawa and other scholars will work this out. Okay, and my answer is the following. When you grow, the more rapidly you grow, there would be a collapse of what we call the household industries. Okay, this is inevitable. The reason is they are inefficient in labor, they are inefficient in capital use, they are highly damaging to the human agency. I mean, we rave about some of our handicrafts industries, but if you look at the hurt to humans in, let's say, hand printing of textiles and such other things, it's just too much. Only an absolutely unethical society like ours could have tolerated the work conditions in some of our informal sector industries. Okay, so when you have growth, the informal sector comes down, and India's informal sector has, in that sense, household has fallen to less than a third of what it used to be. That's good. Okay, but now what happens is a modern small scale, what we call the MSME, really starts somewhere in the middle of the transformation process, and that started in India around the 80s. Now they grew, but their growth has been constrained precisely because the policies have been adverse. Because all our macroeconomic, interest rate, etc. policies do not allow local value addition. Imports are become much more profitable. So if growth is high, these MSMEs would grow very rapidly. Okay, not all of them would become large. Okay, they would grow in numbers. They would grow in value terms. They would all support, be sources of inputs to the larger industries. So Japan. And perhaps Japan actually presents in this sense, the kind of, I would say I'm not saying the model, but somewhere to look, where you can see the future unfoldment. See, whenever growth was high, functional vendor relationships happened. Okay. Whenever growth was low, these turned, parasitic. Okay. So in a high growth period, the relationship between large and small becomes more developmental, more positive. More of a positive sum game. When the growth becomes less, it becomes more of a negative zero sum kind of game. Okay. So the way out is growth, because is number one, growth, and number two, obviously there are policies which can encourage these fellows, particularly if you can work out where there is a value to small. See, where is there a value to small? Economies of owner supervision. By definition, therefore, they would be small in the future. Okay, so if you take an automobile cluster, okay, India would show the similar pattern like Japan. Okay, for two reasons. One is it's the schism in the labor market was similar to that in Japan. So in just like in Japan, you're likely to find this 3-4 tiered layer of auto industries. Okay,
Yes.
so it doesn't mean that all tail light assemblies will finally become Toyota. That's nonsense. Okay, but they'll all be useful to the world.
Yes.
Okay? So this thing, small is not growing. What does it mean? I mean, if 1,000 small units all grow at 10% per annum, but they remain small, okay, it's fine, isn't it?
Okay.
Right? Even if 10 out of them become large and the remaining die, then there is a problem.
Yes.
Okay? There are still some other small which will become high value, industries, iconic kind of industries. So there has to be a science of what you expect the industrial structure to be in late industrialization. Now, once you refer to that, you won't make these kind of statements. Okay? These are all naive statements which are based on very little understanding of history. They become important in conferences and so on to put each other down. Okay, yeah.
Okay. Thank you so much, sir. It was a wonderful session, and
Thank you.
at last, if you could have few words of encouragement for our initiative, Ecoholics.
Wonderful initiative. I hope all the success for you guys. Get more people involved. Let there be debate. As I said, the problem is not going to go away. And a crisis, of this kind allows one an opportunity, because it's during crisis that new voices get heard.
Yes.
Okay? And the limitations of old voices are there. So be open to the possibility that perhaps everything that has been said is wrong. Okay.
Thank you so much, sir. It was one of the wonderful episode of Thinking Tree, especially for the students, especially for me as well. It's an eye-opening one. And thank you so much. My pleasure to have you on my show.
I hope some policymakers also look at it. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Okay.